What you have before you is the sworn deposition of Elias Cord, mine foreman, formerly employed by the Consolidated Silver Star Mining Company of Goldfield, Esmeralda County, Nevada, recorded before the company Inquest Board on the 29th day of October in the year 1907. This deposition is given under oath and penalty of perjury. The witness surrendered a physical article of evidence at the commencement of this hearing, presently logged as Exhibit A, and has offered to provide additional documentary materials, including shift logs, field photographs, and supporting witness statements. This record is sealed, pending the board's determination of whether it will be transmitted to state or federal authorities or retained in the company archive. I will tell you what happened. I will not dress it up, and I will not strip it down. You can decide what to do with it. My job here is to give you the facts in the order they happened, and that is what I intend to do. My name is Elias Cord. I am 38 years of age. I have been working in hard rock mines since I was 19 years old, first in the Leadville district in Colorado, then in the Tintic district in Utah, and for the last 6 years in the Goldfield-Tonopah corridor in Nevada. I came to Goldfield in 1901, when the first strikes were confirmed by the assay offices, hired on with a smaller company called Meridian Metals that was bought by Consolidated within 18 months of my arrival, and by 1904 I was running a shift crew for the Silver Star operation as foreman. Over that time I have supervised or directly participated in more than 400 underground shifts. I know mine behavior. I know rock behavior. I know how a man's voice changes when he is afraid and when he is lying, and when he has simply seen something that does not fit in the category of things he expected to see. I am asking this board to apply those same analytical standards to my account. The Silver Star shaft ran to approximately 440 feet at its deepest surveyed point, as of the 1st of October, 1907. The main gallery ran roughly northeast from the base of the primary shaft, with 3 lateral branches installed at intervals, each surveyed and mapped to the company standard. The operation had been productive since 1904, primarily on a silver-bearing quartz vein running northeast through the country rock, with secondary copper mineralization in the shallower workings. By the summer of 1907, the main vein was thinning, and the company geologist, a man named Fessler, out of the Reno office, had been down twice to assess the remaining ore body. His conclusion, delivered in writing in August, was that the vein would exhaust within 12 to 18 months at current extraction rates, and that the only viable extension of the operation would require new headings driven west and deeper to pursue the geology he believed was responsible for the ore body. The company authorized this in late September. I was given a crew of 14 men and told to drive a new heading west from the third lateral, push as deep as the rock allowed, and report any ore indication to Fessler. The company expected a long drive with incremental results. That is not what occurred. I want to give the board a clear picture of who those 14 men were, because the character of the crew matters to what happened, and because 2 of their names need to be on the record in this proceeding. Augusto Vela was my lead driller. He was a Mexican national from Alamos in Sonora, 41 years old, who had worked the mines at Cananea before coming north in 1903. He was one of the most technically proficient men underground that I have encountered in 20 years of mine work. He understood rock behavior at a level that I have seen in very few men. He was also, I will say plainly, the most intellectually curious member of the crew, the man most likely to ask why about anything unusual, which became a point of friction in the events I am about to describe. Thomas Ware was my second shift lead. Ware was from Missouri, 34 years old, 10 years in hard rock operations in Nevada and Arizona. He was quiet, thorough, and not easily rattled. In 10 years of working with men underground, I had rarely seen Ware show fear, which made it significant when he did. Reuben Hatch was the crew's powder man. He was 26, Nevada-born, trained by his father who had worked the Comstock. Hatch was careful with explosives in a way that some men are not. He did not regard powder as a tool to be used casually. I trusted his judgment with charges completely. Carl Anderson was on the mucking crew. Big Man, Swedish immigrant, had been in Nevada since 1902, worked mines and lumber camps in alternating seasons. He was cheerful in a way that was not irritating, which is a thing that matters in a crew that spends 10 hours a day in the dark. A mucker named Keene, first name Emmett, was one of the steadiest men in the crew. Keene had been to sea briefly before he came to the mines, had worked a year on a fishing boat out of San Francisco, and he had a kind of settled quality that some men develop when they have been in genuinely dangerous situations and come through them by staying rational. He was 30 years old. The remaining 9 men I will provide to the board in written form as requested. 2 of those 9 were James Dolan, age 23, mucker, from Reno, and Philip Garrett, age 31, driller's helper, from Elko. I am giving their names now because they are relevant to the end of this account, and because I am not willing to have their names left out of the official record. We began driving the new heading on the 8th of October 1907. The geology in those first days was exactly what Fessler had predicted. Competent granite, no major structural problems, reasonable progress. We were moving 12 to 14 feet per shift, which was good progress for this type of rock at this depth. The heading was properly timbered as we went. The air quality was acceptable. The temperature at that depth ran warm, but not to a level requiring mechanical ventilation. The men worked steadily and without complaint. The main point of difficulty in those first 3 days was the quality of the timber sets delivered the previous week, which were undersized for the ground conditions, and I put 2 formal written requests to the surface superintendent about this before the issue was addressed. I mention this to establish that my attention in those first days was on ordinary operational concerns. There was nothing unusual about the work or the ground through the 11th of October. On the morning of the 12th of October, Augusto Vela drilled into a void. I was at the face with Vela and 2 members of the mucking crew when it happened. The drill steel had been advancing through solid granite for the preceding 8 hours of drilling on that round. At a depth of approximately 42 inches into the new hole, the resistance changed. Vela felt it before the instrumentation would have shown it, because a driller of Vela's experience feels the machine's behavior as an extension of his own sense of what the rock is doing, and what it was doing at 42 inches was giving way to nothing. He shut the machine and looked at me. I put my hand on the drill steel. The vibration pattern was wrong for solid rock. The bit was advancing into air. We pulled the steel out of the hole and brought a lamp close. I put my eye to the hole and looked through. The hole went all the way through the face. There was open space beyond. This is not by itself unusual. Voids occur in hard rock mining. Gas pockets, natural cave systems, solution cavities, old workings from prior operators who may have entered from a different angle, any of these can produce a void behind the drill face. The procedure is standard. Assess for gas, log it, notify the company, evaluate the void before proceeding. I had encountered 3 voids in my 6 years in Nevada. 2 contained gas and had to be sealed. 1 was a natural cavity of limited extent that we incorporated into the working. None of them had amounted to anything operationally significant. I cleared the face area, and we drilled a second pilot hole, 8 inches from the first. Same result. The void was at least 8 inches across at the face, which meant it was more than a minor pocket. The second hole went through at 37 inches. I lit a candle and held it at the first hole to test for gas draw. The flame bent inward, toward the void. This was unusual. Natural cavities rarely draw unless they are connected to a larger system at lower atmospheric pressure. Old workings would not draw unless they had a surface connection. I noted the draw in the log and sent a runner to the surface with a written note for the superintendent, a man named Aldridge who managed the operation from the surface office, informing him of the void and the draw, and requesting instruction before we proceeded further. Aldridge's response came down by midday. He authorized carefully enlarging the opening to assess the extent of the find and instructed me to document everything and report before end of shift. He included a line reminding me that any significant geological discovery in the new heading area could be of considerable commercial value. I understood what he was telling me. Look, but look carefully. I had the face enlarged over the course of 2 hours, working carefully to avoid overbreaking the opening and compromising the face integrity. By 3 in the afternoon, we had an access approximately 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, sufficient for a man to pass through with equipment. I had the face temporarily supported with additional timber before we attempted entry. Vela went through first. I followed. What was on the other side of that face was not a natural cavity. I want to be precise about this, because it is the point at which this account diverges from anything in my previous experience underground. I have described natural cavities to the board. A natural cavity has rough walls, irregular surfaces, no consistent geometry. What we found on the other side of that face was a passage, a constructed passage, not constructed in the way that mining constructs passages, not with drill marks or blast damage or timber shoring, but constructed in a manner I could not immediately categorize. The walls of the passage were smooth, not naturally smooth in the way that water-worn limestone can be smooth, but uniformly and deliberately smooth, as if every irregularity in the granite surface had been abraded away over an extended period of time. I ran my hand along the wall for the length of my arm and felt no irregularity larger than a grain of sand. The ceiling had the same quality. The floor was level and compacted, with a thin deposit of dust that had clearly accumulated over a very long period without disturbance. The passage was approximately 8 feet in width and 7 feet in height, with a gentle inward curve that limited our sightline to 40 or 50 feet in either direction. Vila stood beside me and was quiet for a moment. Then he said that whatever made this was not mining for ore. He was correct. There was no evidence of extraction in the passage, no ore pockets, no stoping, no dumping grounds for waste rock. The passage was a road. It went from one place to another, and it had been built to do so by something that intended to use it repeatedly for a long time. I noted the dimensions and the wall character in my log. We returned through the opening. I wrote a full addendum to my earlier note to Aldridge, describing the passage and its features, and sent it to the surface. I told him I recommended halting all work in the heading until the company geologist could be brought in to assess the find, and that I was suspending the heading advance until I had further instruction. Aldridge's response was to authorize continued survey and confirm that Fessler was being expedited to the site and would arrive within the week. He told me to document thoroughly. He did not seem alarmed by my description. I did not criticize him for this. A supervised mine passage behind an active drill face is a geologically interesting feature. It is not, by the account I had given so far, a reason for alarm. We went back through that afternoon with 3 additional men and a full complement of lamps. The passage extended further than our lights would carry in both directions. In the thin deposit of dust on the floor, within 20 feet of our access point, we found the tracks. The impressions were clear and deliberate. 3 forward toes, elongated, tapering to what appeared to be points at the distal end. 1 smaller backward-set toe, lateral to the heel. The stride interval, the distance between corresponding impressions, was approximately 30 inches, consistent with an upright biped of significant leg length. The total impression length was 11.5 inches. The width at the widest point was 4.5 inches. The depth of the impression suggested a body weight in the range that a full-grown man might produce in similar dust conditions, perhaps somewhat less. I measured 2 impressions with my tape and recorded the numbers. I then photographed the trackway with the company camera that Aldridge had sent down for documentation purposes. I looked at the trackway for a long moment before I moved on. I have tracked animals in my time, as most men who grew up in the rural West have done, and I know the difference between a fresh track and an old one, between a single passage and a regularly used trail. The dust in which these tracks appeared had been deposited over a long period of time. The tracks themselves were not fresh, but they were not ancient either. The edges were still relatively crisp. The dust had not significantly redeposited into them. My estimate, worth what the estimate of a non-specialist is worth, was that these tracks were somewhere between 2 and 10 days old. They were recent relative to the overall history of the passage. I directed the crew to explore the passage in both directions for a distance of 100 feet. I stationed one man to maintain the heading as our anchor and reference point. Ware took a team south. I took Vela and two others north. The passage north ran for approximately 300 feet before it opened into a lateral chamber. The chamber was 40 feet across, in its widest dimension, and approximately 20 feet in height. The walls had the same ground-smooth character as the passage. The floor was level and clear of debris except for dust. In the center of the chamber floor was a circular depression, roughly 6 feet in diameter, worn into the stone to a depth of perhaps 3 inches, with smooth, rounded edges suggesting repeated long-term contact rather than a tool or blast origin. Around the perimeter of this depression, and extending outward from it to the chamber walls, were additional trackways, many of them laid over each other in the dust in a pattern that suggested the chamber had been used as a convergence point over a very long time. Vela looked at the central depression for a long time. He turned slowly, reading the trackways on the floor the way a driller reads rock. Then he said, quietly, that he thought something slept there. I told him to keep that interpretation to himself until I had spoken with the company. We returned to the access point and found Ware's team coming back from the south. Ware was a composed man by nature, but he was not composed when I saw him that afternoon. He reported that the passage to the south descended at a moderate grade over approximately 200 feet, and then opened into what appeared to be a much larger gallery system with multiple branching passages, all of the same construction quality as the main passage. He said his team had not entered the gallery system because their lamp fuel was not adequate for deep survey. He said they had stood at the entrance to the gallery for approximately 4 minutes, long enough to establish its extent by the lamp range, and that during that time they had heard a sound coming from somewhere ahead of them and below. He demonstrated the sound. He clicked his tongue against the roof of his mouth in rapid succession, a series of hard, fast clicks. Then he said immediately that it was not like that. He said it was louder and deeper, like stones being struck against each other, hard stone on hard stone, and fast. Very fast, he said, the clicks running together, almost like a machine rather than a natural rhythm. I asked how long they heard it. Ware said approximately 30 seconds. Then it stopped. He said that when it stopped, the silence after it was as noticeable as the sound itself had been. I brought the crew to the surface and filed a full report that evening. I included everything: passage dimensions, wall treatment, floor character, the measurements and photographs of the track impressions, the description of the chamber with the central depression, and Ware's account of the gallery system and the sound. I made sketches to accompany the photographs. I requested an urgent visit from Fessler and repeated my recommendation that all access to the new passages be suspended, pending full geological assessment. That night, I lay in my bunk in the foreman's quarters and did not sleep well, which is unusual for me. I am a man who sleeps without much difficulty as a rule. The work is physical and the days are long, and ordinarily I have no trouble. But I kept returning to the trackway in the dust, 11.5 inches, a 30-inch stride, 3 forward toes, the smooth walls, the central depression, the convergence of many trackways from many different directions toward that one point in the center of that chamber. These were not the signs of a small animal that had found its way into a geological cavity. The passage I had walked through had been constructed. The chamber I had stood in had been used regularly over a long period by something that moved bipedally on 3-toed feet and returned, night after night, or season after season, or generation after generation, to the same central resting point in the same chamber. I knew, lying in my bunk that night, that I was not thinking about an animal. I did not say that in my report. I was not ready to say it in my report, but I knew it. Aldridge's reply came before the morning shift. He authorized continued survey and confirmed Fessler for the 14th as I had hoped. He addressed the tracks in a brief paragraph, suggesting they were most likely the marks of a large reptile, possibly a Gila monster of unusual size, that had accessed the cavity through a surface opening somewhere in the surrounding terrain. He noted that large reptiles had been documented in unusual locations in Nevada, and that the smooth wall character was likely a natural geological feature consistent with certain limestone formations in the region, though he acknowledged our geology was granite rather than limestone. He was not dismissive. He was applying reasonable explanations to the available evidence, which is the appropriate starting point. But the appropriate starting point is not always the correct ending point. I assigned a full complement to the survey on the morning of the 13th. 3 teams. 1 to continue mapping the main passage north, 1 to survey the gallery system to the south, 1 to remain at the access point as a base station and secure the exit. I put Hatch at the base station with explicit instructions that no charges of any kind were to be set or detonated in or adjacent to the new passages without my direct authorization. Hatch understood this clearly. He was not a man who needed to be told twice about the responsible handling of explosives. I took the south team myself, along with Vela and Ware and 3 others. We carried full lamp complement, extra oil, tape, notebook, and the camera. The gallery system was substantially larger than Ware's initial assessment, and again I do not say this as a criticism of Ware, but because our first view had been at the end of a 200-foot descent, with limited lamp range. What opened before us when we entered the gallery proper was a space of 40 feet in width and 15 feet in height, running south and descending at approximately 8 degrees, with 4 lateral passages branching from it at irregular intervals, each of the same quality of construction as the main passage. The total mapped extent of the gallery system as we established it over the course of that day's survey was in excess of a 1/4 mile of developed passage, all of it ground smooth, all of it bearing the 3-toed trackways in the dusty sections. The scale of the work, the sheer volume of stone that had been ground smooth, was beyond any reasonable estimate of what a small population of animals could have accomplished. It was also beyond any realistic scenario in which a human population could have done this work without leaving any evidence of human presence. No refuse, no tool marks, no degraded organic material, nothing that appeared to derive from human technology or human biology. The air in the gallery system was notably cool relative to our working level above, and the draw I had noticed at the drill holes was more pronounced here. It moved steadily toward the south and downward, which meant the system connected to something lower and with different thermodynamics, either a much deeper level or a separate surface opening at lower elevation. The draw had implications I noted in my log. Something with a large enough surface area, in a system this extensive, could sense changes in that draw the way a sailor senses a shift in wind. Something that lived in a system of this extent would know it intimately in 3 dimensions. We mapped for 4 hours. The tracks were everywhere, in the lateral passages, in the main gallery, around the walls, and, in 2 locations, on the ceiling itself, where there were isolated impressions in a thin calcite deposit that suggested the passage of something capable of traversing inverted surfaces. I recorded these carefully and photographed them. I did not speculate in my log about what kind of biology could produce ceiling tracks in a natural gate. I recorded what I observed. In the second lateral passage, we found a section of wall that stopped me. The wall surface in this section bore marks, not tool marks, not drill scarring, not the irregular product of geological process. These marks were circular, precise, concentric rings of varying diameters, some of them overlapping each other, some of them crossing adjacent circles, covering a section of wall approximately 8 feet wide and 4 feet in height. The density of the marks was remarkable. They were close together across the full area of the section, and each individual mark was consistent in depth and edge quality. Approximately 2 millimeters deep, clean edges, no variation in the cutting quality despite the varying scales of the circles. The smallest circles were perhaps 2 inches in diameter. The largest were 5 or 6 inches across. I photographed the full section in overlapping frames. Then I took out my pick. I want to explain this to the board clearly. I removed a fragment of the marked wall at this point because I believed, based on what I had seen over the previous 2 days, that the company was likely to seal or blast the access point when the full nature of the find was communicated, and that if physical evidence was not secured before that happened, there would be nothing. The photographs could be questioned, the logs could be doubted, the testimony of 14 miners could be explained in various ways. A fragment of worked stone is a physical object that exists in the world independent of anyone's interpretation of it. I wanted something that could be handed to a scientist and examined. I broke the fragment from the wall with 2 strikes of the pick. It is approximately 6 inches at its longest dimension, irregular in shape, and it shows 3 concentric circles in 3 distinct sizes on its worked surface, with partial marks from adjacent circles on 2 of its edges. That fragment is Exhibit A. I have carried it since the 14th of October. I had just finished photographing the marked section and was wrapping the fragment in my canvas notebook cover for protection when Emmett Keene appeared at the entrance to the lateral passage. He was one of the 4 men I had sent ahead to survey the 4th lateral, the one that ran in the direction of the deeper part of the system. I looked at him, and I knew before he spoke that something had changed. Keene was not a man who showed things easily. He had the quality I mentioned earlier, the settled quality of someone who has been in dangerous situations and come through them by staying rational. He was pale. He stood in the entrance to the lateral for a moment before he came to me, and he took a breath before he spoke. He said that the 4th lateral opened after approximately 60 feet into a large chamber, larger than the one we had found to the north, and that the chamber was not empty and not dark. I asked him what was in it. He said there was light in the chamber that was not from their lamps. He said it appeared to come from the walls themselves, a faint luminescence, even and blue-green, similar to bioluminescent growth he had seen once in a sea cave near Bodega Bay in California, but brighter and more consistent, as if the stone itself was the source. He paused. I waited. He said that in this light they had been able to see clearly across the full width of the chamber, which he estimated at 60 or 70 feet. He said the upper walls and ceiling of the chamber were occupied. He said there were figures moving along the upper walls and the ceiling the way a lizard moves along a vertical surface, traversing the stone with the ease of something that does not regard the ceiling as different from the floor. He said they were upright in their orientation relative to their own body, walking or climbing on their hind limbs, with forelimbs that appeared distinct from the hind limbs in proportion and function. He said they were scaled. He said the scaling was fine, overlapping, and caught the bioluminescent light from the walls in a way that created visible pattern. He said they were not small. He estimated their length, excluding any tail, at 5.5 to 6 feet. He estimated there were at least a dozen of them visible from the chamber entrance. He said that as the 4 men stood at the entrance, the figures on the walls had stopped moving. Not all at once. In sequence, nearest to furthest from the entrance, they had gone still, and they had turned to look at the men. I asked how long the group stood there. Keene said approximately 15 seconds. He said one of the other men put his hand on Keene's arm and they came back to me. I asked the 3 men who had been with Keene to confirm the account. They did, each briefly and each consistently with Keene. I noted the time. I looked at Ware. Ware said we needed to leave. This was the moment at which the argument began, and I want to describe it carefully because it was not a simple argument and because the outcome of it contributed to what happened next. I gave the order to begin a controlled withdrawal north, back through the gallery system to the access point. This order was not immediately followed by all members of the crew. Vela had not been with the team that went into the 4th lateral. He had been mapping the 3rd. He had not seen what Keene described. But he had heard Keene's account by the time I gave the withdrawal order, and he was not yet persuaded that withdrawal was the right decision. His argument, stated clearly and without heat, was this. We had found something that did not exist according to the scientific understanding of the world. If we left without documentation beyond what we had already collected, the company would very likely seal the access point, either to protect the commercial value of the site or to avoid the attention that reporting this kind of find would generate. Another crew would be sent down eventually, or the company would simply blast further into the heading and destroy the passages and everything in them. The beings in those passages would be disrupted or harmed. The scientific opportunity would be lost entirely. We were in a position, at this moment, to do something of genuine significance. He also pointed out that Keen's account described observation, not attack. The figures had stopped moving and looked at the men. They had not advanced. They had not made the clicking sound, at least not in Keen's account of those 15 seconds. If the intention of the beings in that chamber was to harm the survey team, they had chosen not to act on it. These were not unreasonable arguments. I recognized them as not unreasonable while Vela was making them. Ware said, plainly, that we did not need to decide on a theory of intention. We needed to decide whether to advance deeper or leave, and we had enough information now to know that what we were dealing with was beyond our expertise and our authorization, and that continuing without much more careful preparation was a bad decision regardless of how the beings in the chamber had behaved for 15 seconds. Keen, who had been the one to see what was in the chamber, said that he thought Vela might be right that the behavior was not aggressive. He said the stillness of the figures when the men appeared had felt, in his judgment, like assessment rather than threat preparation. He said that if he had to characterize what he saw in those 15 seconds, he would say the figures were deciding something. 2 other members of the crew disagreed openly, saying they wanted nothing further to do with the new passages at any distance. A 3rd man said nothing, but moved himself closer to the direction of the exit. This argument was happening in the gallery system, approximately 300 feet inside the new passages, with the access point to our original heading a further 300 feet north from where we stood. I was listening to the argument, and I was also listening to the passages around us. I heard the clicking first as a single source, distant, from the south, from the direction we had not surveyed, from somewhere lower and further in. It began while Vela was still speaking. It was the same sound Ware had described from the previous evening. Hard stone on stone, very fast, a rapid burst of 30 or 40 clicks, then 2 seconds of silence, then another burst. It was loud enough to carry clearly through the gallery to our position. Then a second source joined it, from our left, from the lateral passage that ran west. Then a third, from our right. I interrupted Vela. I said, "It is behind us now. Move." The men heard it. The argument ended. I want to be precise about the sound and what it communicated, not in the sense of meaning, but in the sense of position. 3 simultaneous sources, south, ahead of us and below, west from the left lateral, east from the right lateral. The only direction from which we heard no sound was north, which was the direction of the exit. That is not a coincidence. 3 sources covering 3 directions, and the 4th direction left clear. That is coordinated. We moved north through the gallery. I gave the instruction not to run, because running in a mine with lamps is how a man loses his light, and loses his direction, and goes from being in a bad situation to being in a catastrophic one. We moved at a fast walk, lamps carried high, staying to the center of the gallery passage. I was at the front. Vela was directly behind me. Ware was at the rear. The sound continued behind us. It did not appear to get closer. It maintained a consistent distance to the south, but the 2 lateral sources, east and west, began moving. I could hear them tracking our progress north. The eastern source shifted north as we moved north. The western source did the same. Whatever was generating those sounds in the lateral passages was moving parallel to us, maintaining our pace, staying even with our position in the gallery. Keen was counting the men as we moved, a thing I had not asked him to do, but which was precisely the right instinct. He called out numbers quietly every 30 seconds or so as a check. We reached the watch station at the gallery entrance. Both watchmen were present and alert. They had heard the sound, but had seen nothing in the passage during our transit. I gave them the order to move, and we all went north up the main passage toward the access point. 14 men. I looked back twice during that transit. I saw nothing in the lamp range behind us. The passage appeared empty. The sound continued, and it had shifted again, both lateral sources, now coming from positions that felt close to the walls of the main passage itself. as if the sources had entered the main passage somewhere behind us and were tracking in the same corridor we were walking. The southern source remained steady and deep. I could not see anything. I kept moving. We passed the chamber I had surveyed on the first day, the one with the central depression. I glanced through the chamber entrance as we passed it. The chamber was dark from our perspective, but the darkness at the far end of the chamber was not uniform. I cannot describe this with certainty. It may have been the effect of lamps moving past an opening and creating shadows in a space with reflective surfaces. I have told myself it was this. But I looked at that far end of the chamber for the fraction of a second that we were passing it, and the darkness there was not the same darkness as the rock. It was a density in the dark. Something was in that chamber and it was not moving. Vela grabbed my arm before I could decide whether to say this. He pointed to the left, to a lateral passage that we had passed on the way into the system 3 hours earlier, a passage that had been dark when we entered. There was movement in it now. Not light, not sound, but the kind of movement that darkness makes when something large and dark is moving inside it, and the edge of your lamplight reaches just far enough to catch the displacement of the air, the shadow of a mass that was itself dark. I told Vela to keep walking and not to stop. We came through the access point into the original heading. I counted the men, 14 including myself, all present. The sound did not follow us through the access point, or if it did, I could not hear it over the noise of 14 men moving fast through a timbered drift. The elevator shaft was 400 feet from the access point, along the original heading. I have walked that 400 feet several hundred times in the preceding years of working this mine. I know every feature of it. I know where the timbers are and where the drainage runs to the sump, and where the lamp niches are in the walls. I did not need to look at anything in that 400 feet. I looked back. I heard the sound again, once, briefly, from the direction of the access point, approximately 1 minute into our transit of the heading. It was close. It was not inside the heading as far as I could tell. It seemed to come from the opening in the face where the void was, from just beyond the access point. One brief burst of the rapid clicking. Then nothing. We reached the shaft. The cage was at the bottom when we arrived, which was our good fortune. I got on the signal line and signaled the surface team for immediate extraction, using the emergency code. The surface team acknowledged within the standard period, and I heard the cage mechanisms engage. I want to describe the geometry of the shaft bottom precisely, so that the board understands what followed. The shaft was a rectangular collar approximately 6 feet by 8 feet. The cage was slightly smaller, a standard 2-deck cage designed to carry ore cars or men, rated for a maximum of 8 men or 2 loaded ore cars. At the bottom of the shaft, there was a station, a widened area approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, where men could assemble and equipment could be staged before loading. In routine operations, the cage was loaded, the signal given, and the cage raised. In an emergency, all hands assembled at the station and loaded in order. I began loading the cage in the order the men were standing when we reached the shaft. I put Ware in first, then Keane, then Anderson, then the remaining men in the sequence they came through the shaft collar. I was counting as I loaded. At 11 men, the cage was full. Not full in the sense that no additional body would fit, but full in the sense that the cage was visibly overloaded, with men packed close, and the frame settling slightly under the combined weight. The cable tension indicator, a simple mechanical gauge above the cage door, was at the upper limit of its rated range. 2 men were still at the shaft station, James Dolan and Philip Garrett. They were looking at me. In my left hand I had the signal cord. In my right hand I had the lamp I had been carrying since we entered the gallery that morning. I could hear the clicking again. It was in the heading, not from the direction of the access point, from within the heading itself, from perhaps 200 feet away, from the direction of the heading face. Something had come through the access point and was in the heading. The cage was at maximum rated load. The shaft was 440 feet. If the cable failed under an overloaded lift, the cage would fall. 11 men. I gave the signal to raise. I gave it immediately, and I do not believe the time between that decision and the pulling of the signal cord was more than 3 seconds. I have since counted 3 seconds to myself many times, measured on a watch, to know how long 3 seconds actually is. It is not a long time. The cage began to rise. Dolan and Garrett were at the shaft rim, watching it go. I could see Dolan's face clearly in my lamp. He was not panicking. He was looking at me with an expression I cannot fully describe. He said something. I could not hear it over the noise of the cage mechanism. He said it again. I heard it the second time. He said, "How long?" I signaled him with my hands that I would return the cage immediately on reaching the surface. I pointed up, made the return gesture, pointed down. He nodded. Garrett was looking into the heading, not at me. The cage went up. I watched it go. I held the lamp and watched the cage ascend, and I listened to the heading. The clicking had stopped. The silence in the heading was complete, except for the mechanical sound of the cable drum far above and the distant noise of the surface operation coming down the shaft. I stood at the shaft bottom for the 3 minutes it took the cage to reach the surface. I gave the emergency hold signal for the surface crew to keep the cage at top while I sent the return signal. Then I gave the signal to send the cage back down. The cage began to descend. I held the lamp at the shaft collar and looked into the heading. I could see approximately 40 feet in the lamp range. The heading was empty for as far as I could see. There was no movement. There was no sound. The cage reached the bottom. The mechanism stopped. The indicator light on the signal board, a simple lantern arrangement we used for two-way communication, showed green. I had given the acknowledgement signal. I waited for the responding signal from Dolan or Garrett. The responding signal would be 2 pulls on the cage signal cord at the bottom, which would translate to the indicator light at the top, flashing twice. The indicator showed nothing. I waited. I gave the acknowledgement signal again. Nothing. I waited for 4 minutes. The surface crew was maintaining position per my hold signal. I looked into the heading for 4 minutes and saw nothing and heard nothing and received no signal from the shaft bottom. I gave the signal to raise the cage. The cage came up empty. The surface superintendent, Nathan Briggs, was beside me when the cage arrived at the top. He had been present from the moment the emergency signal came through. He witnessed the empty cage. He is available to provide corroborating testimony if the board requires it. I ordered the shaft sealed that night. Not permanently sealed, not with explosives or concrete, just closed to traffic with a timber barrier at the collar while I decided how to proceed. The surface crew was told that there had been a structural incident in the lower heading and that access was suspended pending assessment. I sat with Ware that night and then later with Keane. Vella had gone to his bunk without speaking. I did not go to sleep. The company geologist, Fessler, arrived the following morning as scheduled. He was briefed on arrival that shaft access was temporarily suspended. I met with him privately and showed him my full documentation. The shift logs from the 8th through the 14th of October, the field photographs, the measurements and sketches, and Exhibit A. I laid them out on the table in the office shed and let him examine them without commentary. Fessler spent a long time with the photographs of the passage walls. He spent an equally long time with the photographs of the track impressions. He held Exhibit A for perhaps 10 minutes, turning it over, examining the circular marks on its face, looking at the edges where I had broken it from the wall. He told me that the circular marks on the wall section were not a natural geological feature. He said they had been made deliberately, that the method by which they appeared to have been pressed into the hardened granite surface was not consistent with any geological process he was aware of. He said that the photographs of the passage walls were consistent with extended mechanical abrasion rather than any natural smoothing mechanism, and that the scale and consistency of the smoothing across multiple passages suggested a long and organized effort. He said the track impressions, based on the photographs and measurements, were morphologically consistent with a large bipedal reptilian anatomy, and that he was aware of historical reports from this region of similar track impressions, in Nevada, in Arizona, and in one case in New Mexico. none of which had been satisfactorily explained in the published geological record. He also told me, plainly and without apparent discomfort, that he would not be including any of this in his official report to the company. I told him I understood. He said he hoped I did. He said a man in his position, a contracted company geologist with a family, could not file a report asserting that an active mine operation had broken into inhabited passages belonging to an unknown species of large, intelligent reptilian biped. He said that was the kind of report that ended careers and produced outcomes for everyone involved that were considerably worse than simple silence. I told him I understood that too. He examined the site photographs for another hour from the surface, declined to go underground, and left that afternoon. He wished me well with apparent sincerity. The company received my full written report on the 17th of October. I am told it was in San Francisco by the 20th. This inquest was convened on the 21st. Today is the 29th. I have been asked by this board whether, in my opinion, Dolan and Garrett could have survived in the passage system if they took refuge in the lateral workings or the gallery system itself. I will give my honest answer. The beings in that system had demonstrated, over the 2 days of contact, a consistent and coherent behavior. They observed the crew. They did not initiate attack, and when they chose to move the crew out of the system, they used coordination and position to guide the men toward the exit, rather than driving them with violence. Every passage the men tried to access as they ran was blocked, but blocked by presence rather than by force. The only passage left open was the one that led to the shaft. That pattern suggests that the desired outcome was removal, not harm. Whether that same patience and strategy applied when the crew did not all leave, when 2 men remained in the heading while the cage went up, I do not know. I can say that the 2 men were not panicking, that they were not hostile, and that Garrett in particular appeared to be watching the heading with the same calm assessment that had characterized his work throughout his time on my crew. I also have to say, for this record, that I do not know what was in the heading when the cage descended for the second time. I do not know what Dolan and Garrett encountered in the 4 minutes between the cage going up and my signal for it to return. I do not know what happened at the shaft bottom when the cage arrived empty of men. I have told myself various things about these questions over the past 2 weeks. None of them have helped. I am going to say one more thing before I conclude this deposition, and I ask the board to hear it plainly. The passages below the Silver Star mine were not built by anything we are prepared to account for. The beings in those passages are real. They are present, they are organized, they are intelligent in the sense that they responded to our presence with coordinated purposeful behavior that achieved a specific objective. They have been in this ground for a very long time, long enough to build and maintain an extensive passage system in a way that leaves no trace of the technology or process used to do it, long enough that the dust in those passages had been accumulating for a period I could not estimate. 14 men went into those passages over 3 days of survey. 12 came back out. That is the accounting. I am not going to speculate further about what they are, where they came from, or what their relationship is to the broader geological and archaeological record of the region. Other people are more qualified than I am to do that work, if they are given the opportunity to do it. What I am qualified to say is this. If the company sends men back into that heading, those men need to know what is in there before they go. The company has the authority to make whatever decision it wants about the shaft and the heading and the passage system below it. I am not here to tell the company what to do. I am here to make sure the record reflects what happened, so that the next crew does not go underground without the information I did not have when my crew went underground. That is why I am here. That is all I have to say. I am keeping Exhibit A until I am satisfied that it is in the hands of someone who will analyze it properly and report the findings honestly. I said this to the board at the start of this hearing, and I am saying it again at the close. The fragment will not be surrendered to the company archive. If the board wishes to challenge this position, they are welcome to do so. I have answered every question put to me today honestly and to the best of my ability. I have nothing to add, and nothing to retract. I cannot sleep. That is where I am. I know I am on the surface. I know there is nothing in the ground beneath me generating that sound. I know it, and I still hear it when the camp is quiet, and the wind has stopped, and there is nothing to cover the silence. The rapid clicking, from 3 directions, from below, surrounding, and then I hear it stop, the way it stopped when we reached the shaft, and that silence is somehow worse than the sound. Dolan was 23, Garrett was 31, and had a wife in Elko who has written to the company 3 times in the past 2 weeks asking for information and has received a form letter each time. I have not written to her. I do not know what I would say. I will think about this. I sent the cage up. I made the arithmetic come out to 11. I would not tell this board that I made the wrong decision because I do not believe that I did, and I have thought about it long enough to know the difference between regret and error. The cable held. 11 men are alive. 2 men are not accounted for. Those 2 facts are both the result of that decision. What is in those passages knew what it was doing. It was not random. It was not panic. It was a coherent response to our intrusion, patient and organized, and ultimately successful. 12 of the 14 men it wanted out of there are out of there. I do not think about that sentence much. I find it is better not to.